Catherine Schneider from the Fitchburg Historical Society. Today we are at Oak Hall Cemetery. Oak Hall Cemetery is an interesting place. It is the only city-owned cemetery in the city of Fitchburg. And to give you some background on Oak Hall Cemetery, on March 7th, 1853, R.W. Salsbury and his wife Atlanta deeded the property for Oak Hall Cemetery, consisting of 13 rods square, to the town of Greenfield, which later became Fitchburg, for the sum of $1. Many of the Fitchburg pioneer families are buried at this site, and the tombstones in the cemetery provide us with some really interesting clues to the early people of European descent to live here. Why this location for the cemetery? In the 1850s, the hillside that became the cemetery, overlooking the lovely rural landscape, was a short quarter of a mile west of a thriving little settlement at the corner of Fish Hatchery Road and Highway M, known as Oak Hall Corners. It was an early stagecoach stop and had an inn and a tavern as well as a post office. Farms quickly were established near this settlement, and the pioneers needed a place to bury their loved ones when they died. Fitchburg Cemetery Association turned over ownership of the cemetery and existing documentation to the city of Fitchburg in 1987. The association had been formed in 1853, but was left with only 2 aging members and no prospects of finding new members. So the Parks Department now maintains the cemetery, which has been expanded by the city of Fitchburg in recent years to the north and to the west of the original pioneer cemetery back here. Many burials occur here every year in this cemetery. The first settlers of the early 1840s were mostly Yankees and from New York. They found that when they came to Wisconsin, it was very much like their native New York, but a little less crowded, hence coming to Wisconsin to open new farms here. They came easily down the Erie Canal, which had just opened up, and then through the Great Lakes into Milwaukee, Port of Milwaukee, and then overland to Fitchburg. One of the persons I'd like to highlight is Robert Wiley Salsbury, who was born in New York in 1817, next to the youngest of 18 children and the last to die at age 80 in 1897. In 1842, while Madison was just a struggling village and Dane County had just a few white settlers, he came to Wisconsin and began farming here at Oak Hall. He owned this land. He was the one who donated the land for the cemetery. In 1847, he was on the slate of first elected officials for the township of Greenfield, as Fitchburg was known, and became its first clerk. He was one, as his biography says, he was one of the sturdiest and jolliest of the pioneers. While he exercised the utmost charity towards all Orthodox Christian denominations, he was still a Methodist of Methodists. He was a hard-working man, and though he never accumulated great wealth for himself, he helped in no small degree to lay the foundation for the prosperity of the state. So he and his wife lost a number of children between 1847 and 1864, as was typical in the 1800s. Some of the children's names who died young were George Wesley, Julietta, Sahara, who died as infants, Russell at 5 years of age, Mary in 1854, William at age 12, and they did lose a son in the Civil War in 1863. Now we come to the person who is the person who was born the earliest here buried at the cemetery, and her name is Eunice Rose, born in 1779 and lived to 1861, so a very long life. We don't know much about Eunice, except that her family is buried here with her also, probably a son and daughter-in-law and grandchildren who are here. So she must have come as an older person with perhaps her son and daughter-in-law and their family, pioneering here in the early days of Wisconsin. So she was brave in terms of coming at an elderly age to the state of Wisconsin. We have the tombstone of George W. Vroman. The title of the first permanent pioneers to settle in Fitchburg belongs to the Vroman brothers, William, George, and Joseph. They were Dutchmen from New York, trained as carpenters, and were among the first group of men arriving in Madison to build the capital. The Vromans opened a farm in 1839, which is still in the family at the south end of Seminole Highway and Vroman Road. George Vroman was born March 22, 1814, and came up the Great Lakes to Milwaukee in 1836. He and his brother Joseph entered a half section in Fitchburg in 1840, which consisted of 320 acres on Stoner's Prairie. 3 years later, in 1843, George built the first framed barn in the township on that farm. In 1842, he helped erect Badger Mills, the first grist mill for the grinding of grain built in Dane County to serve the local farmers. It was located in what is now South Verona as you enter the city on Highway M. A grand ball was given at the opening of the mill, which drew people from miles around, with dancing reportedly carried on until the wee hours of the morning. Another connection to Verona for George Vroman is that Verona is named after Verona, New York, which is the hometown of the Vroman brothers. George lived in both Mineral Point and Madison after selling Badger Mill. In 1862, George settled on a 144-acre farm in Fitchburg, west of the cemetery here, along Highway M. George is buried with his wife Amy and 7 of their children who died young. Only 2 of their children lived to adulthood. We are at the site of Hannah Bennett's burial. Her father, she was born in 1829. Her father is buried right here beside her. He was born in 1787. He and Hannah's mother left Ontario, New York, and settled in the town of Oregon. Hannah's father owned a farm in Fitchburg east of Oak Hall on Highway M. Hannah married R.C. Bennett in 1848, and they began life in a log cabin with their only son born in 1852. Tragically, Hannah lost her husband in 1854 after just 6 years of marriage. Hannah has 3 generations of her ancestors who were soldiers. Thomas Gilbert, her grandfather, was a Revolutionary War hero. Her father, T. Gilbert, was in the War of 1812, and her brother Thomas was shot dead at the close of the last fight in the Civil War at Spanish Fort on March 27, 1865, after having gone safely through 4 years of war, and to be killed and die thus at the very end of that war. Another brother, James, was a lieutenant in the same company. This is the grave of Nelson Salsbury, who's the son of Robert and Atlanta Salsbury, the early settlers here. Nelson, unfortunately, lost his life in the Civil War. He died in Cairo, Illinois on May 11, 1863. And I want to mention the many veterans who are buried here in the cemetery. As far as we know, there are 3 veterans of the War of 1812. John Dean, Leonard Frank, and T. Gilbert. And again, as far as we know, 9 individuals who were Civil War veterans. Their names: John Beath, Edwin Eaton, E.M.S. Longstreet, Edward Palmer, John Robbins, Nelson Salsbury, who's buried here, Francis Usher, Francis Wallace, and William Palmer. Lewis Adams was born July 27, 1823 in New York, of course. He came to Wisconsin in 1847, settling in Fitchburg on the same farm where he spent his last days when he died at age 81 in 1905. Lewis Adams Farm was located on the west end of present-day Adams Road. Mr. Adams married Mary A. Salsbury in 1848, who was a relative of neighbor Robert Salsbury, who also showed Lewis the farmland that he bought. He purchased his 120 acres with his only remaining capital, and all he had left was his health and pluck, as the obituary said. That winter he fenced 40 acres and cut logs for a house, finishing in 1848 in time to marry on June 28th of that year. He and Mary lived in a log cabin for 20 years and 4 days, moving into a well-built 2-story frame farmhouse. Eventually, Mr. Adams came to own 240 acres of farmland, improved, well-cultivated, substantial buildings, fruitful orchards, and 9 children. Amanda Dean died of dropsy at 84 years of age. She was born in 1799 in Platteville, New York. Her father was a Baptist minister. Her first husband died, leaving her a widow with 6 small children. She married John Dean and came to Wisconsin with him in 1846, where he died just a few months later, leaving her with an infant son and her other small children from her first marriage. By her own industry, the family was provided for. Mrs. Dean's father served in the Revolutionary War. She had 2 brothers in the War of 1812, and 2 sons were in the Civil War. Henry Dinkler, born in 1832 and died in 1877, he and his 5 young children died within a short period of each other during a diphtheria epidemic in 1877 and are buried here at Oak Hall Cemetery. The Dinklers were successful farmers for many generations, living adjacent to Dunn's Marsh in North Fitchburg along Seminole Highway. Henry's parents settled in Fitchburg when they came from Germany about 1850. His son, Charles Dinkler, was the last of the family to live on the Dinkler farm, dying in 1944 at age 83. In the 1880s, Charles helped build the Madison to Freeport, Illinois branch of the Illinois Central Railroad, which is now Badger Bike Trail, which runs through Fitchburg. Charles also was a member of the crew which constructed the Dane County Fairgrounds. He and his brother also did thrashing on farms now occupied by the neighborhoods of Wingra Park and Nakoma in Madison. No heirs were left in the family after Charles's death in 1944 to continue the family name after 94 years of the Dinkler family farming in Fitchburg. It was reported in Charles's obituary that the minister who gave the sermon at his funeral recalled falling into a horse trough as a boy and being fished out by none other than Charles Dinkler. We're in the new part of the cemetery, so many names would be familiar to people in Fitchburg, particularly prominent names like Doug Morissette, who lived from 1935 to 2019. He was town chair for Fitchburg from 1975 to 81, and then mayor from 1993 to 1999. He called Fitchburg home for 48 years. Staff for the city of Fitchburg spoke of him as a wonderful and beloved leader in governing Fitchburg, especially as it transitioned from a township to a city. Phil and Winnie Lacey. Phil was born in 1928 and Winnie in 1933. Both died in 2021. Phil grew up on the family farm in Fitchburg, came from a pioneer Irish family that settled on Stoner Prairie near Muchler Road and Lacey Road in about 1851. Lacey Road, of course, is named after his family. Phil met wife Winnie, who was a roommate of his sister Ellen, when Winnie needed her sewing machine moved, and Phil volunteered. According to Winnie, Phil was a good man, a quiet man and her pillar of strength. Phil and Winnie lived their married years on the farm on Wayland Road, where the present Lacey Gardens are located. Thanks to Phil and Winnie and family's generosity, the gardens are tended by the St. Vincent de Paul Society for helping neighbors in need of food. Winnie had a passion for local and family history and was a past president and board member of the Fitchburg Historical Society. In retirement, she wrote Roads to the Past, documenting family lines coming to Wisconsin. Fitchburg's history is encapsulated in the stories of the people buried here. We learn about the early pioneers with their struggles to establish farms and raise families. Mortality rates were high for children, who often died young of disease. Adults, too, often died, leaving young families behind. War veterans attest to the hardships endured by soldiers, having to leave families, not knowing if they would return. And yet the people took root and formed community, helped one another, and felt each other's joys and sorrows. The farms prospered. Original log cabins were abandoned for solid frame 2-story farmhouses and barns. Roads were built, schools and churches formed. Fitchburg evolved and became more diverse. Today, the cemetery has family members from different races and cultures: African Americans, Hispanics, Hmongs. The Hmong community finds the cemetery particularly suited to their burial custom of the head of the deceased facing west and downhill, overlooking the beautiful landscape. The cemetery has grown and changed, just like Fitchburg. This is our history, hidden in plain sight at Oak Hill Cemetery.